Officer Wade Kessler sat on the witness stand with the kind of calm that only comes from 22 years of never once being told no. He adjusted his tie, glanced at the row of fellow officers behind him, and allowed himself the smallest smile, the kind of smile a man wears when he already knows how the story ends. He had been in rooms like this before, complaints filed and quietly closed, questions asked and just as quickly forgotten. He believed, the way some men believe in gravity, that the system he served would always protect him first. What he did not know, what he could not have known sitting there so sure of himself, was that the man about to rise from the plaintiff's table had spent the last year taking apart everything Kessler thought was untouchable, one document at a time. That man was Marcus Ellison, and by the time he stood to begin his cross-examination, the courtroom had gone still in a way that suggested everyone in the room understood something had shifted, even if they could not yet say what. Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He asked one quiet question, and for the first time in his career, Wade Kessler felt the ground move beneath him. This is the story of how a decorated officer who believed his badge made him untouchable found himself facing a lawyer who had waited patiently, methodically, for exactly this moment. And by the end, you will understand why some men never see the reckoning coming until it is already standing in front of them. Before we go further into how these two men's lives collided, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand what happened in that courtroom, you first have to understand who these two men were before any of this began, because neither of them started out as adversaries. One built a reputation as a steady, respected officer, a man other officers trusted at his word. The other built a career defending people the system had already decided were guilty before they ever stepped into a courtroom. Neither man had any reason to think the other's name would ever matter to him personally. But three questions will follow you through every minute of this story, and I want you to hold on to them, because the answers will not come easily, and they will not come quickly. Who was the woman at the center of a routine traffic stop that should never have escalated the way it did? What did Marcus Ellison already know about this precinct long before this case ever reached him? And what exactly did Wade Kessler assume was buried so deep it could never resurface, right up until the moment it did, in front of everyone? To answer any of that, we have to go back further than the night of the stop itself. We have to go back to who Wade Kessler was before he became the officer everyone in this story would eventually be talking about. 22 years is a long time to wear a badge, and in that time, Kessler built the kind of reputation departments protect. Commendations lined his file. Younger officers looked to him. Supervisors trusted his judgment without asking too many questions about how he arrived at it. And underneath all of that quietly were the complaints. Not many at first. A citizen here, a stopped vehicle there, always resolved the same way, always closed before they could become anything more than a note in a file nobody expected to reopen. Kessler learned early that the system rewarded confidence more than it questioned methods, and that lesson would follow him for the rest of his career, right up until the day it finally failed him. Wade Kessler grew up in a household where respect for authority was never questioned, only expected. His father had spent 30 years working in law enforcement in a different city, and Wade absorbed early on that the badge was not simply a job but an identity, one that came with a certain permission other people did not have. When he graduated from the academy near the top of his class, his instructors singled him out as the kind of recruit departments built entire units around, someone who carried himself with an ease that made both citizens and colleagues trust him instantly. That ease would serve him well for the next 2 decades, and it would also become the very thing that eventually blinded him to how much he had come to rely on it. His first 10 years on the force were unremarkable in the best possible way. He responded to calls, made arrests that held up in court, and built a reputation among his peers as someone who could de-escalate a situation before it became a headline. Supervisors praised his instincts. Community members who interacted with him during routine matters often described him as firm but fair, and for a long time, that description was accurate. But somewhere in the middle of his career, something shifted, so gradually that Kessler himself likely never noticed the exact moment it happened. The complaints began, small ones at first, filed by people whose accounts of their interactions with him did not match the reports he submitted afterward. Each complaint, taken alone, seemed minor enough to dismiss, and dismissed is exactly what they were. Internal Affairs reviewed each incident the same way, checking Kessler's report against his history, weighing his 20 years of service against the word of a citizen with no institutional standing to challenge him, and closing the file with the same conclusion every time. Wade Kessler learned, without ever consciously deciding to learn it, that the system around him would always extend him the benefit of the doubt, and that lesson quietly reshaped how he approached every interaction that followed. He began to trust his own authority more than he trusted the facts of any given situation, certain that his account would always be the one that mattered most by the time anyone reviewed it. This certainty did not make him reckless in any obvious way. It made him comfortable, and comfort, over enough years, can be just as dangerous as recklessness, because it removes the instinct to second-guess yourself when it matters most. By the time he had been on the force for 18 years, Kessler had developed a particular pattern during traffic stops that his colleagues had come to recognize, though none of them thought to name it out loud. He approached vehicles with an assumption already formed, reading tone and body language through a lens shaped by years of assuming the worst of the people he encountered. Most of the time, nothing came of these assumptions beyond a citation or a warning. But occasionally, when a driver responded in a way that did not match his expectations, calm instead of nervous, assertive instead of deferential, the interaction would escalate in ways that later reports struggled to fully explain. These were the interactions that generated complaints, and these were the complaints that Internal Affairs continued to close without much scrutiny, year after year, until the pattern became so normalized within the department that almost no one thought to question it anymore. Marcus Ellison's early years moved along an entirely different trajectory, shaped by a mother who worked 2 jobs to keep him in school and a neighborhood where he watched, more than once, friends and relatives navigate encounters with law enforcement that did not always end fairly. He was drawn to law not out of some abstract sense of justice, but because he had grown up watching people who looked like him lose cases before they ever reached a courtroom, undone by assumptions no one bothered to examine. When he passed the bar and took a position as a public defender, he quickly discovered just how true that childhood observation had been. Case after case landed on his desk with reports that felt, to him, incomplete in ways that were difficult to prove but impossible to ignore. His breaking point came during a case in his 4th year of practice, defending a young man accused of resisting arrest during what should have been a routine stop. Marcus prepared meticulously, certain the inconsistencies in the officer's report would be obvious to anyone who looked closely enough. But the department's attorney arrived with a presentation so polished, so rehearsed, that the jury never seriously questioned the officer's version of events. Marcus lost the case, and his client received a sentence that reshaped the trajectory of his life. Walking out of that courtroom, Marcus made a promise to himself that he would never again walk into a fight that unprepared, that he would learn the department's playbook so thoroughly that he could anticipate every argument before it was made. That promise became the foundation of everything he built afterward. Over the following years, Marcus transitioned from public defense into civil rights litigation, and he began quietly compiling something few of his colleagues understood the scope of. He filed public records requests for internal affairs outcomes across multiple precincts, cross-referencing complaint patterns against officer names, noting which departments closed cases quickly, and which officers appeared repeatedly in the margins of stories that never generated headlines. It was slow, unglamorous work, the kind that produced no immediate victories, but Marcus understood something that many litigators overlooked. Cases are rarely won in the courtroom alone. They are won long before that, in the quiet accumulation of details nobody else thought worth tracking. By the time Marcus turned his attention specifically toward the precinct where Wade Kessler served, he had already spent over a year building a file that few people knew existed. He noted the frequency of complaints tied to Kessler's name, the consistency with which those complaints were resolved, and the language patterns that appeared across multiple reports, small phrases repeated so often they began to look less like coincidence and more like a template. Marcus did not yet have a case. What he had was a foundation, patient and thorough, waiting for the moment when it would finally matter. He could not have known, as he compiled these documents late into countless evenings, that the moment he was waiting for would arrive through his own sister, on an ordinary evening that would change the direction of everything he had built. What Kessler could not see from where he sat, comfortable in his years of experience, was that somewhere else in the city, another young professional was building an entirely different kind of career, one shaped by every case the system had gotten wrong. Marcus Ellison did not come from money or connections. He came up through public defense, taking on cases nobody else wanted, representing people who had already been judged by the time they walked into the courtroom. Every week, he watched officers testify with the same practiced confidence, the same easy authority, and he began to notice something that most people never bothered to look for: patterns. Small inconsistencies that repeated themselves across different cases, different officers, different neighborhoods, but always with the same outcome. He started keeping notes long before he ever had a name to attach them to. The evening that would change everything began the way most ordinary evenings do, without any sign of what was coming. Ellison finished a long shift and started the familiar drive home, the same route she had taken hundreds of times before, past the same intersections, under the same streetlights she barely noticed anymore because they had become part of the background of her life. She was tired in the particular way that comes from a job that demands patience all day long, and she was looking forward to nothing more dramatic than her own front door. When the lights came up behind her, she felt the small jolt of unease anyone feels in that moment, followed quickly by the practiced calm of someone who had done nothing wrong and had no reason to expect the stop to become anything more than routine. She pulled over carefully, signaled well in advance, and came to a stop in a spot that gave the officer clear room to approach safely, the kind of small consideration most drivers never think twice about but that Renee had learned, over years of careful habit, to always extend. She rolled down her window, kept both hands visible on the wheel, and waited. When Wade Kessler approached, his flashlight sweeping briefly across the interior of her car, something in his posture already carried the certainty of a man who had decided how this encounter would unfold before he ever heard her speak. His first question was standard: license and registration, and Renee provided both without hesitation, her voice steady, her movements deliberate and unhurried in the way she had learned to move during any interaction like this one. What happened next depended entirely on who you asked, and that difference would become the very heart of everything that followed. According to Kessler's official report, Renee's tone shifted from cooperative to evasive the moment he asked a follow-up question about her destination, a question that, by his account, she answered with unnecessary hostility. He described her movements as sudden, her compliance as inconsistent, and framed his subsequent decision to remove her from the vehicle as a necessary response to behavior he characterized as escalating. The report painted a picture familiar to anyone who had read enough of Kessler's prior filings, a narrative arc that always seemed to justify whatever came next as the only reasonable response available to him in the moment. But two people walking their dog nearby that evening remembered the encounter differently, and their account would later become central to everything Marcus built in the months that followed. They remembered Renee's voice staying level even as the officer's tone sharpened, remembered her repeating the same calm response to a question. He seemed to keep rephrasing, as though searching for an answer that would justify what he had already decided to do. They remembered the moment he asked her to step out of the vehicle, and the visible confusion on her face, not resistance, but genuine uncertainty about why a routine stop had suddenly turned into something else entirely. They remembered wondering, even as it was happening, whether what they were witnessing had anything at all to do with the reason she had been pulled over in the first place. Renee was placed in handcuffs on the side of a road she had driven more times than she could count, and she spent the next several hours in a holding area before officers determined there was no basis to file charges against her. She was released without an apology, without an explanation beyond a brief acknowledgement that the situation had been resolved. She drove home that night in silence, replaying every second of the encounter, trying to identify the exact moment where a simple traffic stop had turned into something that left her shaken in a way she had not expected. She did not call a friend or a coworker first. She called her brother, because some part of her already understood, before she could fully articulate why, that Marcus would know exactly what questions to ask. Marcus listened to his sister's account without interrupting, the way he had trained himself to listen to every client who had ever sat across from him describing an encounter gone wrong. But this time, something different moved through him as she spoke, a recognition that went beyond professional instinct. When she mentioned the officer's badge number, Marcus felt a strange, cold certainty settle into his chest, because it was a name he had already seen before, buried in the files he had been quietly compiling for over a year. This was not a stranger's case landing on his desk by chance. This was his own sister, describing an encounter with a man whose pattern of behavior Marcus had already begun to understand better than almost anyone outside that precinct. Before we continue further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What followed in the days after Renee's release was, from the department's perspective, entirely routine. An internal affairs review opened automatically, as it did after every formal complaint, assigned to investigators who had processed dozens of similar cases involving similar officers and similar outcomes. Wade Kessler gave his statement with the same steady confidence that had carried him through every review before this one, certain that his account, backed by 2 decades of service and a file free of any formal disciplinary action, would carry the weight it always had. He answered every question directly, expressed measured concern about the incident without ever conceding that his conduct had been anything other than appropriate, and returned to his regular duties within days, exactly as he expected to. For several weeks, nothing about the pace or direction of the review suggested anything unusual. A local reporter picked up a brief version of the story, mentioning a complaint filed against an unnamed officer following a traffic stop, buried among other minor local news items that generated little attention beyond the immediate neighborhood where it occurred. Around the same time, department leadership found itself facing questions about a second, younger officer who had been present during part of the encounter, a patrolman whose separate conduct that same week had drawn more immediate concern from his supervisors. For a brief period, attention within the department began to drift toward him instead. A shift that would have conveniently allowed the original complaint against Kessler to fade quietly into the same category as every complaint before it. Marcus recognized this shift the moment he noticed it, because he had watched departments perform this same quiet redirection in other cases over the years. Rather than wait for an internal process he had already learned, through long experience, rarely produced the outcome it claimed to promise, Marcus made the decision to file a civil suit on his sister's behalf, moving the matter out of the department's hands entirely and into a courtroom where the questions he wanted answered could finally be asked directly. This decision surprised even some of his closest colleagues, who worried the case would be difficult to win without the cooperation of an internal review still technically in progress. But Marcus understood something they did not yet fully grasp. The file he had been building for over a year was no longer simply background research sitting quietly in a drawer. It had just become evidence, ready to be presented in a courtroom that would have no choice but to examine it fully. The discovery phase began quietly, the way most consequential legal processes do, far removed from the drama audiences often expect from courtroom stories. Marcus requested every document connected to Wade Kessler's file going back as far as department policy allowed, and to the surprise of some observers, the department complied without significant resistance, confident that whatever Marcus found would amount to nothing more than a handful of unremarkable complaints, each one closed appropriately in its time. What the department did not anticipate was how thoroughly Marcus had already prepared for exactly this moment. Having spent over a year building a framework that would allow him to see connections across these documents that no single reviewer inside the department had ever been positioned to notice. Depositions began several weeks later, and it was here that the shape of the case truly started to change. Marcus questioned Kessler with the same unhurried patience he brought to every part of his work, avoiding confrontation in favor of careful, specific questions about incidents that, on their surface, seemed to have nothing to do with the night in question. He asked about a stop from 6 years earlier, then one from 4 years before that, each question delivered without any indication of where it was leading. Kessler answered confidently at first, drawing on the same practiced calm that had served him for 2 decades, until the pattern of Marcus's questions began to suggest something he had not anticipated anyone taking the time to assemble. Small inconsistencies, ones that had never mattered on their own, started to look different when placed side by side. District Attorney Patricia Coyle observed much of this discovery process from a distance, initially inclined to support the department's position out of institutional habit more than genuine conviction. She had worked alongside officers like Kessler for years and had grown accustomed to viewing complaints against them as an unfortunate but manageable cost of the job. But as she reviewed the materials Marcus had compiled, cross-referenced against the department's own internal affairs outcomes, she found herself confronting a version of events that no longer aligned comfortably with the narrative she had assumed going into the case. She did not change her position overnight, and she did not share her growing doubts publicly. But privately, something in her approach to the case began to shift in ways that would matter significantly once the trial began. Kessler, for his part, remained largely unbothered by the direction of the depositions. He had weathered scrutiny before, and he interpreted the pointed questions as little more than a lawyer trying to manufacture significance out of unrelated incidents that had already been reviewed and closed by people with far more institutional authority than Marcus Ellison. His attorney reassured him that Marcus's strategy, however thorough, ultimately amounted to circumstantial pattern building rather than direct evidence of wrongdoing on the night that actually mattered. Kessler entered the final weeks before trial with the same steady confidence that had defined his entire career, certain that his record, his experience, and the department's continued support would carry him through this challenge exactly as it always had before. The trial opened on a morning that felt, to most observers in the gallery, entirely unremarkable. Kessler's attorney delivered an opening statement that framed the case in familiar terms, describing a dedicated officer with an exemplary record being targeted by a lawsuit built more on ambition than substance. He reminded the jury of Kessler's decades of service, his commendations, and the absence of any prior formal disciplinary action, presenting a narrative that had worked for the department in countless similar cases before this one. Several jurors nodded along, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though this trial might follow the same familiar trajectory as every complaint that had come before it, ending in the same quiet dismissal that had defined Kessler's career up to this point. Marcus's opening statement took a markedly different approach. Rather than focusing immediately on the night of the traffic stop, he spoke first about patterns, about the difference between a single mistake and a practice that repeats itself so consistently it stops being coincidence. He told the jury that they would hear about one night, but that the true story of this case extended years beyond that single evening, built through a pattern any careful observer could trace if they were willing to look closely enough. He promised them evidence, not speculation, and he asked them to withhold judgment until they had seen the full scope of what he intended to present. It was a quieter opening than the one that preceded it, but something in its measured confidence held the courtroom's attention in a way that suggested this trial might not unfold quite as predictably as everyone had assumed. Before we go further into the trial itself, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. As the prosecution's early witnesses took the stand, the courtroom settled into the familiar rhythm of testimony and cross-examination, procedural officers describing standard protocols, a records custodian confirming the authenticity of various reports. Nothing in these early exchanges suggested the shift that was coming. Marcus used this time carefully, laying groundwork through seemingly minor questions that established definitions and procedures the jury would need to understand later, once the pattern he had been building toward finally came into full view. Kessler watched from his seat with the same composed expression he had worn since the beginning, occasionally leaning toward his attorney to offer a quiet comment, still entirely convinced that nothing presented so far had touched the case in any way that truly threatened him. When Wade Kessler finally took the stand, he did so with the same unshaken composure that had carried him through every difficult moment of his career, settling into the witness chair the way a man settles into a chair he has occupied countless times before. Marcus rose slowly, taking his time before asking a single question, allowing the silence in the room to stretch just long enough for everyone to feel its weight. He began not with the night of the traffic stop, but with a simple question about departmental policy, one Kessler answered easily, confidently, the way he had answered thousands of similar questions throughout his career. Marcus nodded, made a note, and asked another question just as simple, just as easy to answer. For several minutes, the exchange felt almost gentle, methodical in a way that lulled the courtroom into a rhythm that did not yet suggest anything unusual was building beneath the surface. Then, Marcus began the cross-examination that would ultimately define the entire case by returning to a phrase Kessler had used repeatedly throughout his earlier testimony, the phrase that everything he did that night was simply standard procedure. He asked Kessler to define standard procedure in his own words, and Kessler did so easily, reciting language that sounded practiced, almost rehearsed, the kind of answer a man gives when he has said it so many times before that it no longer requires thought. Marcus nodded slowly, then asked him to apply that same definition to 4 separate incidents spanning nearly a decade, each one involving a different driver, a different neighborhood, a different set of circumstances, yet somehow producing an outcome that followed an almost identical shape. Kessler's answers grew slightly longer, slightly more deliberate, as though he sensed the trap forming before he could fully see its edges. What made this stretch of cross-examination so effective was not any single dramatic revelation, but the accumulation of small admissions Kessler made without realizing how they connected to one another. He admitted that his assessment of a driver's tone often shaped his decision-making in the earliest moments of a stop. He admitted that he rarely documented that assessment in writing, relying instead on his experience and instinct to justify decisions after the fact. He admitted that in each of the 4 prior incidents Marcus referenced, no physical evidence had ever contradicted his account, not because his account was necessarily accurate, but because no one had ever taken the time to compare it against anything else. Marcus let each admission sit in the record without comment, building a foundation the jury would not fully understand the significance of until much later in the trial. Then Marcus shifted the questioning toward Kessler's relationship with internal affairs itself, asking how many complaints had been filed against him over the course of his career. Kessler hesitated, the first genuine pause of his entire testimony, before offering a number that was, according to the very documents already entered into evidence, noticeably lower than reality. Marcus did not accuse him of lying outright. He simply produced the actual figure, drawn directly from the department's own records, and asked Kessler to explain the discrepancy. Kessler's attorney objected, citing the difference between formal complaints and informal concerns that never generated paperwork. But the objection did little to erase the visible unease that had settled over Kessler by that point. A man who had spent 22 years relying on a version of his own record that turned out to be considerably more generous than the one the department had actually kept. It was against this backdrop that the sealed document finally emerged, and its impact landed with far greater weight because of everything that had already been established in the preceding hour of testimony. The jury was no longer hearing about an isolated inconsistency from years earlier. They were hearing about the culmination of a pattern Marcus had spent the entire cross-examination carefully assembling piece by piece, each admission a small brick in a structure that was now, finally, complete enough to stand on its own. When the document was read aloud, describing a falsified account from an incident nearly a decade old, the courtroom did not gasp the way courtrooms do in dramatized fiction. Instead, a heavier kind of silence settled over the room, the silence of people finally understanding the full shape of something they had only been seeing in fragments until that exact moment. Judge Marsh's reaction, though restrained, carried its own quiet significance that extended beyond the four walls of that courtroom. Her recognition of the pattern from her own past experience meant that this was not simply one attorney's theory being presented to a jury. It was corroborated, independently, by someone who had encountered the same warning signs years earlier and had, at the time, lacked the full picture necessary to act on them. That realization would later factor into her own reflections on the case, reflections she shared cautiously in later proceedings, acknowledging that systems designed to catch these patterns had failed not through malice, but through a kind of institutional inertia that allowed small inconsistencies to remain isolated long after they should have been connected. Kessler's final moments on the stand looked nothing like his opening ones. Gone was the easy confidence that had defined every prior appearance before internal review boards and departmental hearings throughout his career. In its place was a man visibly recalculating, in real time, just how much of what he had believed about his own untouchability had actually been true, and how much of it had simply never been tested by someone willing to look as closely as Marcus had. When Marcus finally ended his cross-examination, he did not do so with a dramatic final question or a triumphant closing remark. He simply thanked Kessler for his time and returned to his seat, allowing the weight of everything already said to speak for itself, a choice that many observers later described as more powerful than any closing flourish could have been. The verdict, when it finally came, extended far beyond the outcome of Renee's individual case. The jury found in her favor, but the significance of the trial reached deeper into the department itself, triggering a broader review that would ultimately examine years of similar complaints that had been closed too quickly for too long. Kessler faced consequences that reshaped the remainder of his career, and the department that had protected him for over 2 decades found itself confronting a reckoning it had spent years avoiding. Renee, who had remained composed through every difficult stage of this process, finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had been acknowledged, not just for her own sake, but for everyone who had experienced something similar and never had someone patient enough to fight for them the way her brother had fought for her. Marcus stood beside his sister outside the courthouse that day, not as a triumphant attorney savoring a hard-won verdict, but as a brother who understood exactly how long this moment had taken to arrive. What began as quiet, unnoticed research over a year earlier had become something far larger than either of them could have anticipated when it started. The story left behind by this case is one worth sitting with. Power that goes unquestioned for long enough begins to believe it is permanent, and Wade Kessler believed that for over 20 years. But every system built on the assumption that it will never be examined eventually meets someone patient enough to examine it anyway, piece by piece, until there is nowhere left for the truth to hide. The broader conclusion of the case extended well beyond the verdict handed down in Renee's favor. The department, facing mounting public and internal pressure following the trial's revelations, initiated a comprehensive review of complaint patterns across multiple precincts, not just the one where Kessler had served for over 2 decades. Investigators began applying the same cross-referencing methodology Marcus had developed independently, uncovering additional patterns in other officers' records that had similarly gone unexamined for years. Several other cases, previously closed without significant scrutiny, were reopened as a direct result of the precedent set during this trial, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond the original incident that started everything. Wade Kessler's career did not end in the dramatic, singular moment audiences often expect from stories like this one. Instead, it unraveled gradually over the following months, through a formal disciplinary process that stripped away, piece by piece, the protections he had relied on for over 20 years. He faced termination. The loss of his pension eligibility became a matter of prolonged legal dispute, and his name became permanently associated with a case that would be referenced in training materials and policy discussions for years afterward. A cautionary example of what happens when institutional trust goes unchecked for too long. For a man who had spent his entire career believing his record would always protect him, the final outcome was not a single dramatic downfall, but a slow, methodical dismantling that mirrored the very patience Marcus had used to build the case against him in the first place. In the months that followed the verdict, the story of Wade Kessler and Marcus Ellison became something larger than the case itself, referenced quietly in law offices and department trainings as an example of what patience, properly applied, can eventually uncover. Renee returned to the same quiet life she had lived before that night, though something in her had changed permanently, a wariness that never fully disappeared even as the world around her moved on. She rarely spoke publicly about what happened, choosing instead to let her brother's work speak for itself, content in knowing that the truth had finally been placed on the record where it belonged. For her, the case was never about vindication in some grand sense. It was about being believed, finally, after an evening when almost no one outside her own family had been willing to take her account seriously. Marcus continued his work in the years that followed, though the case that began with his sister's arrest became, in many ways, the foundation for everything he built afterward. Other families facing similar circumstances began seeking him out specifically, drawn by a reputation built not on courtroom theatrics, but on the same quiet, methodical patience that had defined his approach from the very beginning. He never spoke about the case as a personal triumph. When asked about it in later interviews, he consistently returned to the same idea, that the real work had never been about winning a single trial, but about proving that patterns, no matter how carefully buried, eventually surface for anyone willing to look long enough and closely enough to see them. Judge Marsh's own reflections on the case became, in time, a quiet turning point in her approach to the bench. She began pushing for procedural changes within her jurisdiction, advocating for more rigorous cross-referencing of complaint histories before officers were permitted to testify without additional scrutiny in cases involving similar allegations. It was a modest reform, unlikely to make headlines on its own, but it represented exactly the kind of small, structural adjustment that prevents future patterns from going unnoticed for as long as Kessler's had. She never claimed credit for the change publicly, understanding that the real catalyst had been a patient attorney who had done the work no one else had thought to do. As for Wade Kessler, the years following his termination were quieter than anything he had known during his career, a stark contrast to the confidence that had once carried him through every difficult moment without hesitation. He rarely spoke about the case, and those who had once considered him a trusted colleague found themselves reconsidering everything they thought they understood about the man they had worked alongside for so long. What remained of his story was not a singular dramatic downfall, but a slow and permanent unraveling, the kind that leaves a person with far more time than they know what to do with to sit with exactly how it all came apart, and exactly how long it had been coming apart before anyone finally noticed. What this story ultimately leaves behind is not a simple lesson about good and bad people, but something harder to sit with. Systems built on unquestioned trust do not fail all at once. They fail slowly, one overlooked complaint at a time, until the accumulated weight of everything ignored finally becomes impossible to dismiss. Wade Kessler was not undone by a single mistake on a single night. He was undone by 20 years of small moments no one had bothered to connect, until someone patient enough finally did. And that, more than any courtroom verdict, is the real story worth remembering long after the details of this particular case fade from memory. Before we go, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. And if this story stayed with you, wait until you hear what happened in the next case we're about to bring you, because some patterns take even longer to surface. And when they finally do, they leave behind consequences no one saw coming.